It may seem unlikely, even impossible to some, but what if I told you that once upon a time, the people of Scotland once ruled the footballing landscape and were seen as the best players in the world? This wasn't just some hot take either. Scotland would prove their dominance multiple times, defeating England by scores of 7-2, 6-1, and 5-1, all in just a 5-year stretch. This was the time that Scotland dominated football. I can hear the calls from Edinburgh and Glasgow now. How come I've never heard about this rampaging Tartan army? Well, it's probably because we're talking about the 1870s and 1880s. Yes, a very, very long time ago. These men were known as the Scotch Professors, and they not only dominated on the field, but revolutionized the game of football itself. The Scottish players were seen as so advanced and talented mainly due to their style of play. It was called combination football, or in other words, just passing to one another. You might wonder how football could even be played without passing to one another, with it being such a fundamental part of football today. But in the Cambridge Rules of 1863, Law 5 stated, when a player has kicked the ball, anyone of the same side who is nearer to the opponent's goal line is out of play and may not touch the ball himself. It was almost a precursor to the offside law, but the upshot was that basically you couldn't pass the ball forward to a teammate. So therefore it made a lot more sense that players playing at this time would try and dribble the ball forward rather than having to constantly pass it sideways and backwards. Whilst this rule was changed just a few years after in 1866, the legacy of dribbling the ball forward on your own and powering your way to goal became the norm in much of England. Dribbling the ball showed your own personal power, and passing the ball would be subtle and unmanly, avoiding the challenge, and that simply would not do. But in Scotland, perhaps because they were less used to the Cambridge Rules and therefore the dribbling culture wasn't quite established like it was in England, they developed a passing game in which they could move the ball around their opponents and open up the gaps in their defence. And this was very successful all the way through the 1800s, as many English teams wanted Scottish players to play for them. In fact, Liverpool's first ever team in 1892 was made up of completely Scottish players. The Preston double winning side of 1888 and the Sunderland side that won 3 league titles from 1892 to 1895 were made up of mostly Scottish players as well. In fact, the owners of Sunderland, Samuel Tyzack and Robert Turnbull, would sometimes go to Scotland to scout for players. But the Scots got very annoyed at the poaching of their talent, so instead they began dressing up as priests to avoid harassment while scouting for these Scottish players. Such was the superiority of the Scottish players, some of the English clubs felt that they needed to try and attract the Scottish players by paying for them. And this wasn't allowed at the time, so this sparked the massive professionalism debate within football in the 1800s. As teams like Blackburn Rovers, Darwin and Bolton Wanderers were all trying to quietly pay Scottish players to play for them. And in particular, in Blackburn's case, this worked out pretty well as they won 3 consecutive FA Cups. Paying players wasn't allowed when it began in the 1870s and wouldn't be allowed in England until 1885. So early on, teams would do it quietly and pretend it was for other work the men had done. But the reaction in Scotland was even more fiercely against the idea of allowing professionalism, with the general attitude being that players who had played for money were traitors and mercenaries. In fact, the Scottish FA even blacklisted players who'd been paid to play. However, eventually the reality struck that professionalism was inevitable in football, and so Scotland too allowed professionalism in 1893. Nevertheless, despite causing this uproar, the Scotch Professors would go down as the first great innovators of football, revolutionizing the game with the rather simple idea of passing the ball. And that is just a little bit of football history. Thanks for watching.